Our second presentation is by Linnea Andersen, archivist from the Social Welfare History Archives. Tales from the S-Files, International Youth Movement, CIA Front, or both. The talk will explore Cold War-era covert CIA funding of American youth organizations.
All right. This talk was intended to be a sampling of mysteries from the archives. However, after I started researching it, I discovered this story of Cold War-era policy and covert CIA funding of American youth organizations that was just too fascinating to pass up. In other words, I truly fell down the rabbit hole. Fortunately, I dragged myself back out in time to write this talk for today. The records of the United States Youth Council in the Social Welfare History Archives include information on its domestic and international programs. They also document the crisis faced by the organization in 1967 when it was caught up in allegations of covert CIA funding of youth organizations through private foundations, including a major source of council funds, the Foundation for Youth and Student Affairs. It's a good story. And while I did not find a smoking gun, I pieced together some interesting information. So let's get started. To understand what happens in the late 1960s, we need some basic information on the Young Adult Council, which became the United States Youth Council, and its international partner, the World Assembly of Youth, as well as the global political scene in which they operated. To set the stage, it's the late 1940s. The Cold War is underway. The United States has emerged from World War II as a world power and has the muscle and money to export democracy. A world international order is developing, influenced by economic, social, educational, and political forces. Youth leadership and international youth exchange are hot. Delegations of young people from all over the world are traveling the globe and working together to build the world of the future. In order to bring this talk in under the time limit, I had to cut out most of the good quotes and a lot of background information. So I substituted this slide to bring us all up to speed. Please note, I will refer to most organizations by a short version of their name from this point out. The Young Adult Council, which becomes the United States Youth Council, was founded in 1945 by the National Social Welfare Assembly, itself a national consortium of youth-serving organizations. The council was a member and major financial supporter of the World Assembly of Youth, which was founded in 1948 as an international organization of youth councils and as a counterpoint to the communist-backed World Federation of Democratic Youth. These two organizations engaged in educational, technical, political, and human rights programs. Other players in our story are the National Student Association, the Foundation for Youth and Student Affairs, the State Department, and the CIA. Financial ties between the Council and Assembly are central to the story. The Assembly struggled to find a sustainable funding model. It relied mostly on dues from member organizations who did not always pay up. And there were internal tensions on the best way to increase income while maintaining independence and avoiding straying into the path of paternalism. The Council became an important source of financial support to the Assembly, just by virtue of paying its dues, but also because it was in position to fund travel, conferences, and special projects, such as those pictured here. Both organizations' need for money in the early 1950s helped to establish a connection between the Council and the Foundation for Youth and Student Affairs. Behind the scenes, the Council was scrambling to come up with funds to meet its obligations to the Assembly. This Herculean task was undertaken in part by Bernice Bridges, the director of the National Social Welfare Assembly's Education and Recreation Division. The financial relationship between the Council, the Assembly, and private foundations solidified in 1950 to 1952, in large part as a result of Bridges' work and because of two important Assembly meetings. The Assembly's first conference, hosted by the Council in October 1951 at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, and its next conference in Dakar in 1952 in what is now Senegal. More than 500 delegates from 63 countries attended the meeting at Cornell, which was financed in large part by donors who wanted to give the delegates an opportunity for a first-hand appraisal of the United States and provide a means of countering Soviet generosity to youth organizations. One of those donors was Arthur Houghton, president of Steuben Glass, a division of the Corning Glass Company in New York, located about an hour away from Cornell, who gave $301,000 in anonymous donations to the council for the event. And I included this slide, and I'm sorry about the quality, I included a slide of the tab of a folder that was really crucial to my understanding of the connection between the foundation and the council. And when you are working in the archives and you come across a folder that says confidential in all caps, there's a good chance you have just found something really good. And I did. So correspondence in the files reflect some debate about open funding versus more indirect gifts, and shows that some donors recognized that American money might be off-putting to some international groups and made plans to provide funds through an intermediary organization, in this case, the council. Note that this report includes, I'm going to apologize, it's very difficult to see, the $301,000 from donor number 1, whom we've identified as Arthur Houghton, and then donor number 4, the $72,500, that is from the Ford Foundation and was to fund travel for delegates from Asia, Latin America, Africa, the Near East, and the Middle East. So many of those places in the world in which the US feels as though it is fighting communism. Letters related to the transaction discuss the decision to offer the travel grants through the council to the Assembly, because there is no advantage in too much emphasis on the United States' role in this subsidy. The pattern of channeling American money to the Assembly through the Council was set. The meeting in Cornell was the origin of the Foundation for Youth and Student Affairs' ongoing relationship with the Council and the Assembly, and Houghton's involvement in funding this meeting appears to have been key to establishing these connections. Archival documents, including this letter right here, show how the unspent funds from Houghton's contributions were returned to him and were used to help seed the foundation. Houghton also served on the foundation board. This foundation brochure outlines its goals to focus on the problems of youth in our times and their promises of sympathetic interest and funding for worthy projects. Its source of funds were described as a small endowment, along with grants from board members and interested friends, all individuals who have long been concerned with assisting young people. Ever the tireless fundraiser, Bernice Bridges wrote to Houghton in May of 1952, stating that the council was very much interested in the new foundation and expressing the hope that the foundation board will occasionally permit us to present for consideration some of the important young adult council and World Assembly of Youth needs. The foundation became a major donor of the council, at one point 90% of its budget, and through it, of the Assembly. The 1952 Assembly Conference in Dakar helped to strengthen these ties. This council financial statement shows a contribution from the foundation right at the top of $8,442 to fund travel for the US delegation. And then the delegation reported back that its African travels had inspired it to plan a field program to strengthen local assembly groups in underdeveloped countries, and also to help youth in other countries understand America. In her thank you letter to the foundation, Bridges wrote, "I believe the Dakar meeting and ensuing tour was an excellent demonstration of what the World Assembly of Youth can mean to underdeveloped areas. It was also further evidence of the importance of the World Assembly of Youth as a channel for interpretation of the United States." The ongoing financial relationship between the Foundation, the Council, and the Assembly is documented through funding requests and financial reports in the United States Youth Council records, which detail expenses adding up to tens of thousands of dollars annually, including equipment, translation services, travel and hospitality for U.S. and international delegations, technical assistance grants, events, some operating expenses, and eventually staff salaries. The Council was rarely turned down, though the Foundation did question spending $6 per person for a dinner and $4 on 5 espressos, if you can imagine that, in 1960. So far, so good. But what does the CIA have to do with any of this? At this point in my research, it was not 100% clear. Some more digging was needed. And this is where I really went down the rabbit hole, with a visit, or should I say multiple visits, to the CIA's online Freedom of Information Act reading room. Documents available on this site help make the case for a connection between the CIA and student organizations starting in the early years of the Cold War, when international youth exchange was identified as a potential anti-communist resource. The financial connection may have started with the intelligence community's interest in the World Assembly of Youth, which appears on a list of anti-Stalinist forces in a secret memo dated February 20th, 1950, written by the Interdepartmental Intelligence Committee for International Communism, known for some reason as the Jigsaw Committee, and only the US government could turn that committee name into the acronym Jigsaw. Do not know how that happened. The committee appears to have been composed of heads of intelligence from the Navy, Army, Air Force Joint Chiefs Atomic Energy Commission, as well as the State Department Special Assistant for Intelligence. Another memo indicates that as of the fall of 1950, Jigsaw's priority program was going to be implemented by the CIA and the State Department. Another example of a connection between youth organizations and anti-communist strategy is the Campaign of Truth, which I feel needs to be said in capital letters. A 1951 campaign report calls communist propaganda the Soviet Union's most powerful weapon in its struggle for world conquest, and warns that it will poison and delude the minds of men as a preliminary to their enslavement. International exchanges are specifically listed as part of the strategy to combat the travesty of truth spun by the Kremlin. The report notes that youth make up the majority of international exchanges, and that grants from foundations and student organizations are important to these international programs. And again, in 1952, a report titled, Catalog of the Techniques and Means of Power Presently Available for the Psychological Support of U.S. National Security Objectives, written by the Psychological and Paramilitary Programs Psychological Strategy Board, identified the Assembly as the largest anti-communist international youth organization and listed it in its inventory of resources presently available for psychological operations planning. And we have just an excerpt of that inventory here. As noted earlier, the State Department was also interested in youth exchanges. The United States Youth Council records document connections to the State Department through meetings, trainings, requests for information for delegates, and most significantly for our story, through requests for information about funding sources. For example, a 1952 letter to the State Department thanked them for funding suggestions and asked for more ideas on financial support. The letter also contained a list of projects that needed money, including sending delegates to the Assembly meeting in Dakar, which was subsequently funded by the Foundation for Youth and Student Affairs, as we saw earlier. There is some limited evidence that the Council also reported back to the State Department on what they learned from their international contacts. I found a few such letters filed in the archives. Connections were definitely being made in the early years of the Cold War between CIA and State Department strategy and the success of American youth organizations operating on the international scene. In addition, the World Assembly of Youth was on the radar of both the State Department and intelligence communities as an important resource, and the Council was the most direct U.S. conduit to it. So connections between the CIA, private foundations, and youth organizations can also be traced by press coverage from the 1960s when the story broke and dragged both the foundation and, by association, the Council and Assembly into its orbit. Let's jump ahead to 1964, when an accidental discovery provided fuel for existing rumors about the CIA and U.S. student groups. An investigation by a Congressional Committee on Small Business accidentally uncovered 8 private foundations being used as CIA funding conduits. This brought press attention to the issue. The CIA doubled down, deciding to work on being more careful about keeping the program secret, which in turn helped draw more attention from the press. It's funny how that works. So, in February 1967, the New York Times, Washington Post, and Washington Star ran articles on foundations as conduits for CIA money, and the story was eventually confirmed by the State Department. Things really took off in March of 1967 when Ramparts magazine ran a story on covert CIA funding of the National Student Association through private foundations. The association was comprised of student government representatives from around 300 colleges, and it is important to our story because its CIA connections are the best documented and were later proven in testimony by participants and in investigations and through confirmation by the State Department. The article described a covert financial relationship dating back to 1952 involving the CIA and private foundations, including the Foundation for Youth and Student Affairs. Some association officers signed the National Security Pledge and were in the know, or witting, as the CIA termed it. The story broke when the current president signed the pledge and was let in on the secret, to his dismay. He sought alternate sources of funding and also told another staffer about the arrangement, and that person went to Ramparts. It didn't take long for other student organizations funded by the foundation to be implicated, including the council and, through them, the assembly. Denials started to fly, including Arthur Houghton's terse explanation quoted in this article. If at any time I have cooperated with our government as a citizen on matters affecting the national interest, that is my own affair. The Council, the Assembly, and the National Social Welfare Assembly scrambled to issue statements. The Council declared its opposition to covert government influence, but also to what it called allegation without documentation by Ramparts. It attacked using a guilt by association tactic as much when it comes from the far left as from the far right. It stated that council officers had no relationship with the CIA, no reason to think one existed, no reason to believe the foundation was covertly government funded, and they cite Houghton's statement to the press as evidence. They also cited the fact that funds were given without conditions attached, as well as the fact that some of the council's international programs were counter to government policy, as a proof that they were not government controlled. The National Assembly and the World Assembly gave similar denials and explanations. This reasoning by all three organizations that CIA-connected funding was simply impossible because they don't know about it and act independently, frankly, falls a little flat. While repercussions within the community of youth organizations were expanding, the government established a committee to investigate. The Katzenbach Committee was formed in early 1967 by President Lyndon B. Johnson and was comprised of Nicholas Katzenbach, Undersecretary of State, John Gardner, Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Richard Helms, the CIA Director. Katzenbach later speculated that LBJ composed the committee that way because Helms would oppose all changes, Gardner would want everything changed, and Katzenbach would compromise. The Katzenbach Committee's report to LBJ, pictured here, in March of 1967, basically confirms the CIA program by saying it was all part of government policy and in response to a surge of communist support for youth organizations. Such assistance was given pursuant to the National Security Council policies beginning in October 1951. Please note that this is 2 months after the council hosted the assembly meeting in Cornell, New York. And with the subsequent concurrence of high-level senior interdepartmental review committees in 4 administrations. The report suggests that these policies now need to be re-examined and explains that the increased number of foundations since the 1950s makes it easier for student groups to get funding that is not from the government. It also notes that only a small fraction of the large number of groups doing overseas work received covert assistance. The committee suggested the following policy. No federal agencies shall provide any covert financial assistance or support, direct or indirect, to any of the nation's educational or private voluntary organizations. And also called to immediately make it clear to other countries that the activities of private American groups abroad are, in fact, private. On recommendation from the Katzenbach Committee, LBJ ended CIA funding of student organizations in early 1967, and it's important to note that that's CIA funding specifically. Another document that I found on the CIA site gives a retrospective view of the CIA's program as well as the events of 1967, and is a key piece of evidence to help flesh out our story. The 1976 Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligent Activities report cited the Katzenbach report as a watershed moment in the CIA's relationship with U.S. institutions. It also notes that the Katzenbach Committee had full and unfettered access to most files and documentation. Conversely, it notes that the committee was also seen, and this was later acknowledged by Chairman Katzenbach, as a way to limit inquiry into all clandestine CIA financing and to provide damage control. The report also includes a section on the CIA's use of private foundations prior to 1967, confirming that the CIA viewed the struggle between communist and democratic institutions as a key to the Cold War, and that it subsidized, advised, and even helped develop private organizations that would compete with the communists around the world. And I'm quoting, "Large amounts could be transferred rapidly and in a form that need not alert unwitting officers of the recipient organizations to their sources. The funding pattern involved a mixture of bona fide charitable organizations, devised foundations and funds, frontmen drawn from a list of America's most prominent citizens, and lawyers representing undisclosed clients." The outcome of all of this was a public relations and financial crisis that threatened to undermine the Council and Assembly's international work in the areas of education, technical and economic development, and human rights. Archival documents show them responding to allegations from within and outside their organizations, facing a crisis of confidence from membership, and dealing with the resulting financial losses. The minutes of the Council's Executive Committee meeting from March 3rd and 4th, 1967, provide a picture of the repercussions for the beleaguered organization, and this is just a lightning summary of 2 days' worth of minutes. Staff noted problems accessing documents and recounted how they tried unsuccessfully to get more information from the foundation, including one staff member's visits to the IRS to try to get the foundation's tax forms. The National Student Association staff, including the newest witting president, not the one who initially revealed the story, shared information on the CIA and youth organization ties to the foundation. The tone started to degenerate with calls for an investigation, accusations that some council members had signed the national security oath, vehemently denied, warnings against creating a witch hunt atmosphere, and reliance on circumstantial evidence. And let's not forget the 1-hour break for a bomb scare. Ultimately, a commission of members was established to investigate. The commission met a number of roadblocks, and these, as well as its findings, are detailed in its report delivered to the Council in April of 1967. The commission reviewed documents, corresponded with the Katzenbach Committee, which appears to have basically stonewalled them, and collected testimony, or tried to, including 40 hours of taped testimony, which sadly is not in the archives. Its work could be a case study of what happens when people in the know don't have to comply with the people doing the investigating, who are not in a position to force the issue. The main points of the Commission's report were: 1, it was difficult to collect evidence. 2, the CIA and Foundation influence on the Council was possible because of probable CIA interest in their programs and because of current and past connections between Council officers and the CIA or the Foundation. And I'm quoting, "The Council was and is now vulnerable and susceptible to any efforts the government may have wished or wishes to make to influence its operations." Number 3, it appeared that Council officers did not sign the national security oath, and those accusations are not supported by the evidence. It is worth noting that there was some debate about this at meetings in 1967, and there is evidence suggesting that at least the International Affairs Vice President had signed the oath. And then number 4, allegations regarding the CIA and the Foundation for Youth and Student Affairs were likely true, because even though the Commission found nothing, the testimony presented and the Foundation's refusal to disclose its funding sources made it impossible to dismiss the alleged connection. The Commission members' account of their attempt to get information from the Foundation is worth quoting more fully. The report recalled that Harry Lunn from the Foundation for Youth and Student Affairs held up the statement of contributors to let the Commission see that there was such a statement, but that he did not pass the statement around for the Commission's close examination, all right? Mr. Lunn gave as his reasoning the fact that some of the contributors to the Foundation did not want the fact that they were contributors or the amount of their contributions to be known. The ultimate result was a resolution that the Council would only solicit foundations with private sources that file tax forms and that reveal their sources of funding, and would accept government funding only if offered and received publicly. Although it appears that the World Assembly really did not know that the CIA was probably funding it through the Council, it also faced financial and political outcomes as well as loss of its members' confidence that they were indeed operating freely and independently. This slide shows some Council resolutions on the CIA funding issue in French and Spanish, delivered by the Council President to the Assembly meeting in Brussels in 1967 as part of their attempt to rebuild relations. The CIA scandal did not kill off government funding entirely. Back in the United States, the Council was working to shift more of its operations and international programs funding to the State Department under its new category of institution-building activities, which are referred to in this newspaper clipping here. So I tried some creative digging, a lot of it, but I was not able to find CIA or Foundation documents showing a transfer of funds with the amount of time available that I had to research this talk. I did eventually have to just stop researching it. It's not surprising that it's hard to follow the financial trail from the government to the Foundation, though the funds from the Foundation to the Council are easy to trace. And as noted in the 1976 report, and in these and other press articles, the CIA used layers of funding to pass funds through foundations to recipient organizations, making it difficult to follow the money. But I do invite further digging in the archives. And it's worth ending with a final quote from the Congressional Investigation Report of 1976 that I read from earlier. And it notes that many of the restrictions developed by the CIA in response to the events of 1967 appear to be security measures aimed at preventing further public disclosure, which could jeopardize sensitive CIA operations. They did not represent significant rethinking of where boundaries ought to be drawn in a free society.